Hey, all you experts out there, this is the Monetize Your Expertise podcast, where we show you how to use your skills to pay the bills. Have you ever wanted to create a business that positions you as the industry leader and go-to expert? Join me every week to hear from amazing leaders and entrepreneurs who have successfully refined their skills in order to become experts and create extremely profitable knowledge businesses. To find all of the links and tools mentioned in this episode, just go to myepodcast.com. I'm your host, Grant Weherley, the online course guy, helping you every week to monetize your expertise. Hey everyone, it's Grant with the Monetize Your Expertise podcast. Today I wanted to talk to you about how to not freak out. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in reality, we all deal with tons of stress in our everyday life. And if you're listening to this, you're probably an entrepreneur or some kind of creator, somebody who's ambitious and wants to accomplish something with their life. And that means it's probably going to involve more and more stress as you grow and scale that project, right? Like it never goes away. Stress is something that's a part of everyone's life all of the time. And as you do more and more interesting things at a larger scale, all you're going to do is trade up problems at a larger scale. So even if you're the richest man in the world, it's not like, bliss, no stress. Everybody's got stress. And so we all have times when we kind of break down and, are kind of just overwhelmed. And how we handle that is really, really important. And it's very, very difficult as well. So the reason why I personally wanted to bring this up is this is something that I've worked very, very hard on for the past several years. I've actually got a bit of a family history of this kind of thing. A lot of my people in my family are like, a majority is actually on antidepressants or some kind of anxiety medication at some point in their life. So I've got a bit of a genetic predisposition towards this. And if you go there, it just kills everything that you're doing. It totally derails all of your projects. You get that negative mental talk in your head. And so it's just really counterproductive and also really impacts your happiness. So this is one thing that I've been trying to put together for a long time, which is kind of a framework for how to approach freak out moments when they inevitably occur. When you get overwhelmed, stuff's falling apart, and you're tempted to freak out, do you just try and run away? Do you try and escape the situation? Do you try and indulge in really negative habits? That's another common thing that happens. So here's what I put together. And actually, the trigger for this is that this kind of happened to me last week, is that I kind of got overwhelmed. A lot of things happened at once that were really stressful. I was in that space of overwhelm, very, very stressed out, feeling kind of like directionless and just unclear. And then I went through this checklist, and then I was really happy that very, very quickly I sorted things out. So I was able to go from like freaking out, like the world is ending, to, okay, cool, take stock, get back on track, and be really, really in a good place from a terrible place in, a couple days, very, very quickly. So let's go through the two sections of how to deal with freaking out. And again, this is coming from somebody who's like freaked out quite a bit and used to be very predisposed to doing so. So there's basically two categories of when you encounter stress and overwhelm, how to actually deal with it. The first category is the biological side of things, right? So if you're feeling an incredible amount of stress, then part of that is biological. There's the psychological and the biological elements of that. And so the biological approach is a partial solution because it's kind of more of like addressing the symptoms, and it just sets you up to do the psychological stuff much more effectively. Because it's like if you're having a panic attack and you're in the middle of a panic attack, well then of course you can't really do very many psychological exercises. It's better to prevent yourself from drinking the 10 cups of coffee which caused the panic attack, right? So it's important to address things from both sides. So here's 5 steps to immediately address the biological symptoms of being overwhelmed, overstressed, and when you're in that freak out moment, here's how you can get back on track. Step 1 for the biological side of things. Avoid caffeine, nicotine, all nootropics, all stimulants, at least temporarily. This one's really, really important because what you might be tempted to do is to go harder on the coffee in order to, give yourself additional energy to deal with all the stressful problems that are coming up, right? But that's actually the opposite of what should be done. You need to stop all of the things which tend to jack up your heart rate and cortisol levels, and then you'll be much more clear-headed to do the psychological things later. Number 2 is to really prioritize sleep. It's to go to bed 1 hour earlier, wake up 1 hour later, and just really focus on getting that restorative sleep, which will, at it's a huge additional step towards getting you to be less stressed. Because of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that if you don't get enough sleep, you'll already feel more stressed. And to sort of really prioritize that, again, instead of trying to, like, oh, I got to stay up extra late and wake up extra early in order to handle these things which are going wrong, instead, that's probably just going to make you freak out more. Instead, the additional sleep will be very, very healthy for you, your body and your mind. Step 3 is to consider a couple supplements which can help you immensely with this kind of thing. Personally, I take l-theanine and or St. John's wort. So those work a bit differently. L-theanine, you can read about it on your own, but basically it's more for influencing GABA in your brain, which is very calming, puts you more in a zen-like state. St. John's wort is more about serotonin. So if you're like kind of in the basically, I'd say take theanine if you're like kind of ramped up and just feeling stressed. But if you're like burnt out and kind of like semi-depressed, then St. John's wort might be a better option, or you can combine the two quite effectively. And it's amazing what this simple strategy can do is if you take those two things and then just do some meditation and breathing exercises, it pretty immediately puts you in a very optimistic Zen state, even if you were freaking out before. Number 4 for the biological side of things is to eat ridiculously healthy. So you might feel tempted to indulge in junk food if you're stressed, or maybe it's like, I don't have time to eat healthy. I don't have time. I'm freaking out, so I'm just going to go to McDonald's or whatever because it's easy and I know where it is. No, actually, you got to slow down, take the time to very intentionally eat the most healthy thing you can possibly find, like fish and vegetables only kind of thing. Because if you give in to that temptation of indulging in that junk food type stuff or whatever you feel impulsively inclined to eat, you might feel good for 5 minutes, but then you'll actually feel more stressed as the sugar and other unhealthy things hijack your body and make you feel worse. And finally, for the biological stuff, number 5 is to get a really good workout in. There's a ton of great research about how physical exercise, especially intense physical exercise, stimulates all kinds of awesome effects on your brain and your body, very de-stressing. So that's the number 5 step to get your body in order. So quick recap, avoid stimulants, prioritize sleep, consider l-theanine and or St. John's wort, eat ridiculously healthy, and number 5 is to get in a really intense workout. If you go through those 5 steps as the first attack on your stress and overwhelm, you'll be in a great place biologically to be able to move on to the next level, which is the psychological stuff. And by the way, you can do all of this stuff in just a few hours to get yourself back on track, which is much better than freaking out for like an entire week, right? Phase 2 of addressing massive stress and not freaking out. Now, this is the 10 steps of psychological readjustment that I found works really, really well for me. Maybe some of these will work for you, some of them won't. Maybe you'll add in some additional things that you found work. But actually, this is a bit of a combination of Stoicism, Buddhism, fatalism, a lot of different frameworks. And I've kind of pulled out pieces that I found work really well for me. And so chances are some of these will really resonate with you. And actually, I have these 10. And each of these 10 have worked at different times, but they don't always consistently work, which is why I go through all 10. Because, sometimes something works randomly and doesn't the next time, So you never really know what kind of mental exercise is really going to click with you that time. So step 1 is to slow down and release the guilt associated with taking a break. So if you're a type A, sort of very driven personality, an entrepreneur, and you're feeling overwhelmed, there's a good chance that you respond to stress by trying to be more controlling, ramp up the things that you're doing, be more intense, to take charge of the situation, to reduce the external things which are causing you to feel overwhelmed. And generally, that's not the best approach, at least not in the long term. You might have to do that for like a couple hours to deal with some situation. But in general, if that's your approach to stress, that'll just cause you to be more burnt out. So step 1 is to release the guilt associated with slowing down. Like, it's okay to take a break and fix yourself internally before moving on. And I put this as step 1 because this is actually the number 1 psychological mistake that I still personally make. When I feel stressed, I tend to speed up, and it's like the worst thing I can possibly do. Number 2 is to label what you're feeling. So this is the concept of like, if you're angry, if you're feeling depressed or stressed or feeling angst towards a particular person or situation, just sit down, figure out what it is you're feeling and give it a name. By the way, to label it and not really investigate the details of it, like, this relates back to my childhood and why is this happening? And, don't dive into it, just purely label it. And the reason why you want to do that is because there's a great study which shows that it engages the part of your brain which is more rational and sort of stabilizes your emotions more as soon as you go into that labeling the emotions type perspective. So it immediately kind of calms you down and allows you to step back from those emotions so they're not overwhelming you. But you also don't want to dive too deeply into them to be like, why am I feeling this way? And like, how can I fix this? Because chances are that's not the best approach because you're not calmed down enough to go there. And if you dive in them too deeply, you'll just get overwhelmed with them again. Step number 3 is to purely ask yourself the very simple question of, will it help to freak out? Will it help to be stressed right now? Will it help to feel overwhelmed? Now, this is one of those things that either really works or really doesn't. It's a bit it is very, very rational, right? And so usually when you're freaking out, you're feeling irrational. But sometimes that can be all that you need to trigger yourself to just kind of laugh at yourself and realize this is kind of hilarious. I'm freaking out for no reason whatsoever, and there's no reason to do that. So sometimes that causes you to be able to just let it go instantly. Number 4 is called the flashlight technique. Now this one it's a bit tricky to explain because it's kind of subtle, but basically it's to metaphorically shine the flashlight on the negative emotions that are overwhelming you, whether that's stress, fear, anger, jealousy, whatever that is, and to like really investigate that and sort of in order to have the realization that it's not a real thing in the world. It's not something which objectively exists. Actually, you can relate it back to what's called dependent arising in Buddhism, it's a really interesting concept, which is that things only exist in relation to other things. And so, for example, your sense of anger is like a ripple in a pond, right? It's not something like the ripple's there, but it's not like a thing which exists like the water does, right? It's something which is just a temporary fluctuation in your mind, right? So sometimes the simple exercise of thinking, where is the emotion? Like, does it really exist? Just sort of like trying to have your mind's eye see the emotion and realizing you can't because it doesn't independently exist. Sometimes that can cause it to immediately melt away. Related to that, you can also ask yourself and shine the flashlight on, is the thing that you're freaking out about something real or only in the past or future? So for example, is this stressful thing only in my mind, remembering the past or projecting the future, or is it something that's happening right now? And 9 times out of 10, it's going to be something which does not exist right now. It's something that you're remembering or you're fearing will happen in the future. And so it's not really that useful in most cases to worry about something that's not even happening, right? You're stressed about something which has either already happened or may not happen in the future anyways. Number 5 is to practice perspective. Now, what I mean by this is to understand the fact that whenever you're feeling very stressed and overwhelmed and unhappy, inherently in that perspective, you have the view that whatever is happening is like unfair, it's extremely unpleasant, it's a bad thing. Like in your head, you're labeling it as a very negative thing, right? Well, what you can also do is to practice the perspective of viewing adversity as an opportunity for growth. And this is not just a mental trick, it's actually quite true. Because if you think about any negative experience, there's always something extremely positive that you can learn from it, whether that's a skill or some kind of resilience. There's always something good, a silver lining, which can come from any form of adversity. A really good book on this topic that I found quite inspiring was called The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. So I'd recommend checking that out if you'd like to explore that topic in particular more. Number 6 is to throw in a bit of stoicism, and that's to ask yourself, what do you really need in life in order to be happy? And to answer that truthfully, it's not, you don't need a Corvette to be happy. In reality, most people only really need a handful of very important things to be quite happy. And that's generally along the lines of like sufficient resources to be healthy, a nice social circle, the opportunity for growth. Like the things you really need in life are generally things that if you have the technology to listen to this podcast right now, it's going to be very hard for you to lose those things because they're so basic. They're so easy to come by in modern developed society. And now the reason why that's really useful to reflect on is because it kind of gives you this sense of almost invulnerability, right? Like the worst thing that can possibly happen with whatever you're stressed out about, whatever you're worried is going to happen, whatever you're fearing, even if everything goes terribly wrong and you lose essentially everything, you're probably still going to be able to feed yourself, you're still going to have shelter, you're still going to have the same friends most likely, unless they're based on you being rich or something, which then they're probably not very good friends to begin with. And you'll probably also have access to opportunities for growth, right? There's probably free classes in your city, and you can go to a library and read books. So the basic things that you need in order to be a happy, functioning person are generally things that you can't really lose. And this realization can be quite powerful because then you realize that no matter what happens, whatever you fear isn't something that can make you unhappy unless you make it, unless you view it that way. Now, we should also give a side note that, of course, there's circumstances for all of these which maybe are more or less applicable depending on what you're worried about. Like, for example, if you just lost a loved one, well then, maybe that stoicism perspective isn't quite as helpful. However, some of these other ones might help as well. So number 7 is to see if you can actually force yourself to laugh at yourself about whatever it is you're stressed and worried about. If you can force yourself to get enough perspective to realize it's kind of funny that whatever you're worried about, right, it's so superficial, it's so fleeting, it's so temporary. No matter what it is, there's a good chance that it either won't ever happen, even though you're freaking out about it, or it maybe will happen, but then next week you'll be totally fine. But there's all this kind of like internal misery that we tend to cause for ourselves by that sort of stress and worry and fear and negative emotions that we generate ourselves, right? The external events in the world never actually cause you to be unhappy. It's your own reaction to them that cause unhappiness and various negative emotions. And so if you can kind of force yourself to have that realization and force yourself to see that as humorous, that can usually break yourself out of whatever mindset you're in and start to help you see the light of the more optimistic way of viewing the world. Number 8 is also a bit related. It's to recognize the infinite nature of the world and of opportunities that you'll receive. So that might sound kind of woo-woo, but I don't mean it that way. Actually, what I mean is that the worst thing in the world is going to be temporary. For example, if there's like a smear campaign on your public persona or something, and it goes all over the internet, well, that might suck a lot for like a year, but then maybe next year nobody even cares anymore, right? No matter what happens, it's almost always very, very temporary. And so if you can sort of mentally view your situation and whatever it is that you're caught up in emotionally right now, and you can zoom out in your mind's eye and sort of see yourself as a very small piece of the overall picture, and you can sort of zoom out of the timeline of your life and realize this is a very, very tiny moment of your overall life, I find that very calming. It can sort of give you perspective to realize whatever you're caught up in and you think is such a big deal is probably not that big of a deal. Number 9, this is some advice that comes from a book I've actually mentioned several times on this podcast by the Dalai Lama. It's called The Art of Happiness, and there was one little piece of it that I really, really, really liked, and I use it all the time. I think about it all the time, and it's the perspective of anxiety and how you should never really feel anxiety if you're doing your best. So basically, if you try really hard at something, say you have some business venture that you want to venture into and you want to give it your all, you're going to try your best. It's a very genuine, venture that's like not trying to cause pain or suffering for anybody else. It's a genuine thing that's going to be helpful to the world. You're going to do your best at it. You're going to go all in, but you're anxious because you're worried that you'll go all in and you'll fail at it, right? Very, very common anxiety. And actually one common response to that anxiety is to then hold back and not try your best in order to protect your ego. But instead, it's very helpful to realize that think about the phrase trying your best, right? So if you're trying your best and you fail at something, why would you possibly feel bad about it? Because if you genuinely tried your best, by definition, you literally cannot do better than what you just did. And so like all you can do is try your best, and either it succeeds or it won't. And if it doesn't succeed, well, then there was no possible way for you to succeed. And at the very least, you learned something from it. And so there's only two options. Either you don't succeed and there was never any potential for you to succeed because you can't do better than your best. You can only learn from failure after trying your best. Or you succeed, and then of course you're not going to be worried about that. So I find that little, it's very simple point, very, very profound and useful, because if I ever get anxious about something and I'm, giving a particular kind of speech or something that I've never given before and I'm worried about messing it up, then you're just reflecting like, hey, I should just try my best and do everything I can to do a great job. And in reality, whatever I'm worried about probably won't happen anyways. But even if it does, I did my best. That's never something to feel bad about. Because to feel bad about it is to essentially say I should have done better than my best, which doesn't even make sense. And finally, number 10 is sort of the last step. And this is the step to deal with whatever's left over after the first 9 exercises. So say you go through the first 9 and maybe you feel a bit better, but you're still sitting with that really negative feeling of anxiety, of fear, of whatever it is. The final step is very simply just to understand that whatever it is temporary, and to allow it to be there. This is to acknowledge the fact that you can't always get rid of every negative emotion very, very quickly. Hopefully you can, or at least you can make it softer. But even if you still have something sitting with you, gnawing away at you, simply sitting there with the understanding that this feeling is unfortunate, but I don't have to react to it. I can just let it sit there. And I understand that probably tomorrow or the next day, it will come to pass. And then I'll feel quite happy. And the day after that, I might feel unhappy. And then, there's a million other emotions you're going to experience. So whatever temporary pain or suffering or anxiety you're sitting with, we'll just sit there and, okay, that sucks. It'll go away eventually. Now, the importance of that last point is to understand that if you keep a separation between what you view as yourself and your negative emotions, that'll prevent you from doing something like reacting in a really unfortunate, unproductive way to that negative emotion if you identify it with it, right? So, for example, if you're very anxious or depressed, you'll tend to view things very negatively, right? And so maybe somebody says something to you and you view it as a very negative criticism. Well, in reality, there's a good chance that could just come from within you, right? And if you identify with the emotion itself, then you'll sort of believe what it tells you, that oh, this person's really mean, when in reality, you're just stressed. And if you keep that separation, you can almost just kind of laugh at yourself and be like, oh, that felt bad. Is probably coming from my own perspective itself. So those are 15 steps, 5 biological and physical, 10 psychological, to help you get yourself unstuck, out of stress, to escape overwhelm when you're in a very adverse, anxious situation. Hopefully that helps. And I hope the key takeaway that you have from this podcast episode is to understand that there are ways to deal with feeling stressed and anxious and overwhelmed. And you don't have to just stick with it or have negative coping mechanisms. It's something which can be resolved, usually pretty quickly. And even if you're still sitting in that negative space right now, I encourage you to have enough mindfulness to not make really poor decisions in that space. Because the number one thing that I learned from having these kinds of experiences many, many times is to never make an important decision when you're in that negative space. When you're overwhelmed with some negative emotion, never, ever, ever, ever make a strong, important decision. Because if you end a relationship, if you decide to quit your job or do something very drastic within that negative space, it's usually more in a reaction to the emotion which you're experiencing, which, like we talked about, is not necessarily related to the external world. It's kind of coming from you to some extent. And so if you're making that decision based on that emotion, then as soon as that emotion subsides, there's a good chance that you'll very strongly regret what you did. In fact, it's the whole concept of taking 10 breaths before you respond to something that upsets you, right? Age-old advice, which still holds true. So I hope you take this advice, these steps, and you apply it within your own projects, because The more you can handle stress, the more capable you will be of achieving greater and greater success. Because what'll always hold people in general back from achieving the things that they're working towards is if they can't handle the pressure of that, the pressure of success, actually, or the pressure of working towards success. So that's why I think this is one of the most important things any entrepreneur or ambitious person of any type can learn, is how to manage their own emotions for the sake of their happiness, for the sake of their sustainability of their project, so they don't get burned out. Really, really important. So if you have any strategies at all that you found very, very helpful that you would like to add to this list, of either list of the biological stuff or the psychological stuff, please email me at grant@myepodcast.com. There's a good chance I'll personally try it out, because I'm always looking to expand my own knowledge of how to deal with stress, right? How to be more resilient, and also share it with everybody else as well. And as always, thanks for listening. Hey entrepreneurs and experts, I just wanted to thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you learned at least one new big idea that helps you evolve your skills and gets you closer to monetizing your expertise and creating that successful knowledge business. Make sure to hit that subscribe button on iTunes and Stitcher, and check out myepodcast.com for all episodes as well as the tips and tricks mentioned in this episode. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.